Hey, this is Math Minutes Pro with Dr. Harrison. Today we will talk about how to use the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation. This is a pretty long problem, but it's a common problem that students have to solve when you're solving problems in Algebra 1, Algebra 2. You might even see it again in pre-calculus, depending on what kind of textbook. But we're just going to go ahead and get started. All right, so first thing I want to begin with is listing or stating the quadratic formula. All right, so quadratic formula is known as x equals negative b plus and minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and all of this divided by 2 times a. That is the quadratic formula. And we're going to use the quadratic formula to solve or find two values of x. Now, the first thing I'd like to begin with is talking about or stating the quadratic equation in standard form. So I'm going to write this as, let's see, I'm going to call this standard form. And the equation for the standard form of a quadratic is a times x, a times x squared plus b times x plus c equals 0. Now we're going to come back to that. Just going to kind of block that off a little bit. We're going to come back to that in a moment, and it'll make sense why we need to know that. So we're going to start with our quadratic equation, which is x squared minus 6 times x minus 16, set that equal to 0. Now we're going to see why this matters in standard form. Okay, if you notice, the variables in the quadratic formula are b, a, and c. And you notice in standard form, we see the coefficient of the first term is a, the coefficient of the second term is b, and here we have a constant of c. So we're going to identify a, b, and c in this quadratic equation so we can substitute it in the quadratic formula. So in this quadratic equation, what is the coefficient of the first term, x? You're right. So it's 1. So we're going to say a equals 1, and b in the second term is negative 6. We're going to say b equals negative 6, and c, the constant, is negative 16. c equals negative 16. Very good. We've identified the key variables in the quadratic formula. So now we're going to go ahead and substitute these values in the formula and solve for x. So let's begin. I'm going to just separate this here, and let's go ahead and get started. X equals, now negative b. b is negative 6, and we're going to treat this coefficient of b, which is negative 1. So I'm going to write negative 1 times, what's b? b is equal to negative 6. So that's going to be times negative 6. Very good. We got our plus and minus, the square root of, bring that over there. We have b squared, so that's going to be, b is negative 6, negative 6 squared minus 4 times a is equal to 1, times c, and c is equal to negative 16. So that's times negative 16. All right, we substituted in the first part, but now remember, it's everything over 2 times a. So that's going to be 2 times what? A is equal to 1, so that's 2 times 1. Here we again, let's review. This is very important. You want to make sure that you have all of these numbers correct. X equals -1 times b, -1 times b, which is -6, plus and minus the square root of -6, because we have b squared, which is -6 squared, minus 4 times a, which a is equal to 1, times c, which is c is equal to -16, and everything divided by 2 times a is equal to 1. So it looks like we're good. Let's go ahead, and now it's just a matter of simplifying everything, but there's a way that you got to do it to where your work is clear. So let's go ahead and get started. So we have x equals -6 times -1 is a +6. So we got a +6 plus and minus the square root of -6 squared. You're right, it's 36. Minus 4 times 1 times -16. So what's -4 times 1? -4 times 1 is -4. -4 times a -16, that's going to be a +64. So that's plus 64. Okay, looking good. And all of that is divided by 2 times 1, which is 2. Okay, we're looking good. Now we're going to go ahead and simplify what's under this square root symbol. So bring down the x. X equals 6 plus and minus the square root of 36 plus 64, yes, 100. Usually simple quadratic formulas, you'll have a perfect square under the square root symbol, and sometimes you don't. But in this case, it's going to be really nice and pretty. And that's all divided by 2. Almost there. X equals 6 plus and minus. What's the square root of 100? 10. Right. All divided by 2. Now, this is the point that gets tricky. We're not done yet, but this is the point that gets tricky. In my teaching of the quadratic formula, I'm going to show you how to separate this so that you get 2x values, and it'll be easy to solve that problem. So I'm going to draw an arrow over here, and see where it says x equals 6 plus and minus 10 divided by 2? We're going to separate that. So here we have x equals 6 plus 10 divided by 2. That's where that's coming from. And then 6 minus 10. 6 minus 10 divided by 2. So we're separating it. Now it's just a matter of addition and division. X equals 6 plus 10 is what? 16 divided by 2, comma. 6 minus 10 is what? Right, -4 divided by 2. Okay, we're looking pretty good. One more step. X equals, I don't like to skip steps. Some students will try to do this stuff in their head, but I don't recommend that you skip steps. Write it all down so that the last step of solving every problem is to check your work, and you can have something to check. So 16 divided by 2 is 8. -4 divided by 2 is -2. All right? So we have successfully solved this quadratic equation, x squared minus 6x minus 16, and our values of x equals 8 and x equals -2. Now, usually we'll stop right there, but you're wondering, what does that mean? What does that mean? X equals 8 and x equals -2. Well, I'm going to show you what that means. And what that has to do with is what this means in reference to a graph. All right, so remember, this is called the quadratic formula, okay? So a quadratic is where you have an equation whose variable, the highest exponent of the variable is 2. But what also makes a quadratic with respect to a graph is the fact that you can represent a quadratic in the shape of what is called a parabola. So let's go ahead and get going with that, a parabola. Now, first thing I want to do is draw the XY axis. Okay, and I'm just doing a simple sketch. Okay, this is the X and Y, this is your Y axis and your X axis. So we're going to go ahead and sketch a parabola. It's a U shape. Okay, that's how you know you have a graph that is a parabola. And let me go ahead and just label that. All right. Parabola. I'm building our vocabulary here. And that's the parabola right there. That's the graph. Now, the values of x, where we say that x equals 8 and x equals -2, actually represent the x-intercepts. The x-intercepts are right here where the point intersects, where this graph intersects the x-axis here and here. Okay? So let's say we have, this is the point -2, 0. That's where that's coming from, where x equals -2. And then here, this point, the coordinate for this point would be, that's not right. You caught it. I did that on purpose because that's one of the mistakes sometimes students will make. If this is the positive side of x, shouldn't that be 8? But I've seen students do that. They'll do all of this work, and then if the teacher asks them to graph it, they'll make a simple mistake, all right? If x is 8, it would have to be over here, so that should be 8, 0. And you're right, over here, you have -2, 0. -2, 0. All right? So this would be -2 here, and this one would be 8. So we ask the question again, what does x equal 8 and x equal -2 mean? Well, these are the values, we call them zeros, okay? What that means is if you graph this parabola that represents this quadratic equation, you're going to find that this parabola intersects the x-axis at 2 distinct points. And the coordinates for those points are -2, 0, also known as -2, x equals -2, and 8, 0, also known as x equals 8. So I'm going to put this over here, the coordinates. We have 8, 0, and we have -2, 0. Same thing over here. So again, what do we call them? They're known as zeros, or we call them roots. That's referring to this point over here, okay, and this point over here. So these two coordinates correspond with these 2 points. We call them zeros or roots. So if you have a 2-step problem where it says they give you the quadratic equation and you need to solve the quadratic equation, and you go through all of these steps, you get your values, x equals 8, x equals -2, and then the second step says graph, if you will, the quadratic. It's a function. If you have to graph it, or if they want you to identify the zeros and plot the zeros, you notice that the zeros mean the points where this parabola, 2 points, where this parabola intersects the x-axis. All right? So we've said a lot today. Now, complete definitions of the terms that I've used are included in the description below. So thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to check out my Patreon page in my video description below. On my Patreon page, you can get access to exclusive math lessons, study tips, live Q&A, and more. See you next time.